The impact of the Supreme Court in 2022 has been unprecedented, and as Christians, we have plenty of reasons to celebrate these wins in faith, family, and freedom. Welcome to Freedom Alive. As you may have noticed, the U.S. Supreme Court has been making history this term. So many decisions have been made that will impact generations to come. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, protection of Second Amendment rights, the increased freedom of speech, and free exercise of religion. All are major victories for religious liberty and freedom for families across America. I'm joined again by co-host Matt Staver. And Matt, it's clear that religious liberty is the prime focus of those who currently serve on our Supreme Court.
It sure is. I mean, this is a very strong court for freedom of religion. And obviously, in the 2022 term, free speech, it begins with the May 2 decision that we have at Liberty Counsel, Shirtley versus City of Boston, a huge case. And then it is actually bookended at the end of the term with the Coach Kennedy case, and that involves free speech, free exercise of religion, and more as well. So this is an incredible term. In between, you have this amazing decision that overturns the 1973 and 1992 abortion decisions. Generations in the making with generational impact.
One for the ages. It's a Supreme Court term that will be felt for generations to come. We cannot wait to talk about it. But our Freedom Alert is next.
We cannot be content by simply sending abortion back to the states. I'm Matt Staver, co-host of Freedom Alive. Dr. Haywood Robinson was in college when the Supreme Court handed down the Roe v. Wade decision. Later, abortion through the second trimester was a routine part of his medical practice. Dr. Robinson said, "Money has a way of finding its way into your pocket if you let it. Once you start making money off abortion, you're going to make sure it stays okay." But he knew something was wrong with putting a woman in stirrups and taking out a baby. He embraced Jesus Christ and now has a strong resolve to end abortion once and for all. Robinson said, "We need to double down until the inalienable rights in our nation's founding documents are guaranteed for all Americans. Indeed, it is time to expand and protect the sanctity of human life in every state in the nation."
Up next, Matt's interview with Holly Mead of Liberty Counsel.
The most important term of the United States Supreme Court occurred in 2022. It's hard to underestimate the impact of these decisions because they were generations in the making, but these decisions are going to be generations in their impact as well. These particular cases involve the free speech clause of the First Amendment, the free exercise clause, which is strengthened even more so as a result of these cases, overturning a 51-year-old precedent that haunted both the free speech and free exercise clause, and amazingly, overturning a nearly 50-year precedent that goes back to 1973, Roe v. Wade, and then later in 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the abortion decisions. Holly, let's take them in order
let's
because
unpack them a bit here.
It's an incredible series of cases that came down between May the 2nd and the last one would be June 27, 2022.
Probably something you didn't expect this past year with all, after starting Liberty Counsel and wanting to strengthen religious freedom and overturn Roe. You probably didn't expect all this to happen all in one term.
You know, it's like incredible that it all came to pass in one term. So if you go back even to 1989, you talk about starting Liberty Counsel. I was a pastor before going into law school, as you well know, and one of the things that frustrated me, and in fact, one of the things that really catapulted me from the pastoral ministry into law was the issue of abortion. Watching a video.
The Assignment Life video.
The Assignment Life video on abortion, and it showed an actual first trimester abortion. It showed back then models, we didn't have the ultrasound imaging like we have today, of the baby inside the womb as it progresses through the various levels of development. It showed the 1965 Life magazine, historic, groundbreaking article with photographs of the baby in the womb. And then it also obviously focused on the Supreme Court about what happened on January 22, 1973.
And that's almost shocking to me to think, Matt, you were a pastor and you thought abortion was okay.
I thought that it was a heavy menstrual cycle.
And
I
I'm
did
sure
not
you're not
realize
alone in that
that
either,
it was a real human being that was at issue there. And I would have
Right.
never imagined what I saw in this video,
Right.
this documentary, that it's a little baby that's being ripped up. I just never
Education
imagined
makes a
that.
difference.
Because
Yeah.
back then, 1983 is when I saw this video. It came out. There wasn't a lot of documentation. There was not a lot of videos. This was one of the first
Right. We didn't have
ones.
sonograms like we do
We didn't
today.
have sonograms like we have today. And so what you see is what you see in the media.
Mm-hmm.
And the media just uses terms like pro-choice and reproductive freedom, those kinds of things. So you don't really understand what this is
Reproductive
about.
health, the use of euphemisms, yeah.
And then when I was really confronted with it as a pastor, I was shocked. And that's what led me into law school and
Right.
eventually the founding of Liberty Counsel in 1989. Also as a pastor, as a layperson, and just as anyone else, Christmas time would come around and what would happen? Another nativity scene would be challenged, and the nativity scene that had been there for years now is removed. Why? Because a letter from the ACLU back then intimidated the city to take down the nativity scene.
Atheist organizations gets offended.
And so that was frustrating to me as well. So when we started Liberty Counsel, we had a couple of objectives. One is to strengthen the free speech of the viewpoints and expression. We didn't use the word viewpoint back then. That was something we later developed and litigated as a strategy. But to strengthen the free speech rights of individuals
Right.
from a religious perspective, to strengthen the free exercise clause to be able to have freedom of religion, to ultimately overturn a 1971 decision called Lemon versus Kurtzman that was part of the problem of why these nativity scenes and other kinds of symbols were being challenged and removed. And then to obviously overturn this 1973 abortion decision, at the time Roe v. Wade, and then later 1992,
Right.
Planned Parenthood versus Casey.
Right. So we fast forward this term and we start with our amazing 9-0 victory at the Supreme Court in our shirt lift case for the Christian flag.
Yeah, May the 2nd was when all of this began. Between May 2 and June 27, all of those objectives that I mentioned came to pass. It's unbelievable. And the impact is incredible. We'll talk about that later on as we move through this series of cases. But May 2 is when it started.
Right.
And it was on that day we got a 9-0 decision in Shurtleff versus City of Boston, and that's the case involving the Christian flag on a public forum flagpole in Boston City Hall Plaza.
And that's not often that you get all of Supreme Court agreeing, especially when it's regarding religious freedom. That's rare.
That is
That's a miracle.
exceptionally rare, and it is
Yeah.
a miracle to get a 9-0 decision with no dissents and no deviation from that particular 9-0 decision. That particular case has an incredible impact because it's not about just a flag. In fact, the flag is almost tangential because the flag itself did not cause the problem. The flag could have been raised and there would have been no incident.
Right. It was the name of the flag.
It was the name of the flag on the application. The word Christian caused the problem. And so they were upset by the word Christian. If Hal had called it anything secular, like a Camp Constitution flag, we wouldn't have had a Supreme Court decision, and he would have raised it in 2017. It would have been a non-event.
But then Justice Breyer, who would tend to vote on the left side, wrote the opinion for the case.
He
That's
wrote
another
the opinion
miracle.
for the case. The amazing thing is that when our opinion was released on May the 2nd, there's two things that were happening. Number one, later in the day,
We were celebrating.
we were celebrating,
Yes.
and then there was a leaked opinion from the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was the Dobbs abortion decision, which we'll talk about, that came down on June 24.
Right. That put a little damper on the
And
celebration, but
it sort of, I mean, but then when you read the opinion, you thought, oh my goodness, they're actually going to overrule these abortion decisions, and we were
Right.
just praying
Yes.
that case would stay the same.
that was amazing.
But the other thing that was actually happening, which we didn't know at the time, we knew the Coach Kennedy case had already been argued. We knew that they had already voted on that because they vote the same week of the oral argument.
Right.
We didn't know who was writing that opinion. And guess who was writing that opinion at the time that they released our case on May the 2nd? It's the same justice who wrote the concurring opinion that criticized Lemon. It's Justice Gorsuch writing the Coach Kennedy case. And that came out on June 27.
And of course, Coach Kennedy was a football coach who silently would pray on the 50-yard line after the games. He didn't invite anyone else to join him. People started joining him when they saw what he was doing, but he was silently praying, and he did that for several years, but then suddenly the school decided he couldn't do that anymore.
In the Coach Kennedy case, Coach Kennedy could actually kneel and he could think about where he is going to order the pizza for the gang afterward.
Right.
He could think secular thoughts. He could actually protest the flag if he wanted to, like people kneel during the Pledge of Allegiance or the singing of the national anthem. And that would have been okay, but if he thinks religious thoughts, if he thinks prayer...
If he appears to be praying, then that's a problem for them.
Then it's a problem, and so they censor him. And they do it because of Lemon. And Justice Gorsuch writes the opinion, and that case is both a free speech and free exercise of religion case, and at that point in time, Lemon is finally buried for good.
Right, and they actually referred to our Shurtleff case in the Coach Kennedy opinion.
Yeah, he cites to it, and he refers back to our Shurtleff case on May the 2nd, saying that none of the justices actually used Lemon to support the city's or to side with the city of Boston's position. And now finally he criticizes the Lemon test called Lemon versus Kurtzman, citing Shurtleff, and now Lemon is gone. This is a 51-year-old precedent that up until this time, on June 27, was causing conflict and warring between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise and Free Speech Clause, and oftentimes overpowering both of those.
That was amazing.
No more.
Right.
51 years, it's gone.
Yes.
May 2, June 27, the beginning of the 2022 term of these amazing cases, the ending of the 2022 term, June 27, and they are bookends of each other.
And then we had a great decision regarding religious freedom and school choice.
Yeah, that
Maine.
was June 24. So in between June 24, you had this Maine decision.
Right.
And that was the case involving school vouchers. Maine,
Kaysen versus Macon, I think,
yes,
wasn't
that's
it?
what
Yeah.
it is. And in fact, in that case, Maine has rural places where there's no public schools. So consequently, they allow vouchers for someone to bus or to take their child to a private school. But no religious schools are allowed.
They offer like a public assistance to those schools, but they were censoring, they were not allowing the Christian families to get assistance.
Yeah, they couldn't, the Christian family, if they wanted to send their children to a Christian school.
Right.
So you could send your child any place else, but not to a Christian school. And that went on for a number of years. Some parents challenged it. And as a result, what happened is the Supreme Court sided with the parents, and that strengthened the free exercise clause, that you cannot discriminate against religious free exercise or based on religion when you have a funding operation or a voucher program that otherwise is available for others except those that want to choose Christian schools.
Right, and of course, before we get to the grand finale, we did have a great victory in the Second Amendment as well.
We also had amazing victory in the Second Amendment, and that was written by Justice Clarence Thomas. That was something that was done very consistent with the history of the Second Amendment.
Right, that was in New York, I believe.
Yeah, that was in
happened.
New York with regards to, you had to show special cause why you would have a concealed weapons permit or the need for one. And Justice Clarence Thomas said, there's no other constitutional provision where you have to show a special need to be able to have free speech or free exercise of religion. You just have those constitutional protections, and the Second Amendment is no difference.
And you know, Matt, I think sometimes it's so easy for people to get discouraged and think, you know, things aren't going so well in America right now. Our government isn't so great. But you look at these decisions and you see what God is doing through the Supreme Court and through these decisions. He is still on the throne. He is still in control. And then, of course, June 24th was a big victory with the Dobbs case being overturned.
Yeah.
Or actually, the Roe versus Wade being overturned.
Yeah, with Dobbs overturning Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about this. This is absolutely unbelievable that this happened in the sense that it happened during our lifetime.
Right.
It's not unbelievable from a constitutional standpoint. It's unbelievable that it lasted that long from a constitutional standpoint, because even those who are supporters of abortion, scholars, have had to admit, and the Dobbs decision actually says this, that there's no constitutional basis for abortion. You know, when they came up with this idea back in 1973, it was a 7-2 decision, and they couldn't find in the Constitution where abortion would be permissible. They said it may be in these various amendments, and they listed off a bunch of amendments. Could be in the 14th Amendment. We don't know where it is. Perhaps it's somehow glowing from the outer edges of the Constitution. They couldn't find it, and they said, nevertheless, abortion, and then the Doe versus Bolton case, handed down the same day,
Right.
said that you could get an abortion for essentially any reason. So for 9 months, any reason, psychological, familial, economic, doesn't matter. If you had a, say, I need to get an abortion, you could get an abortion over 9 months, up until the very moment the child is born. And that has been
Right.
the case from January 1973.
But you know what is appalling to me, Matt, is that both of those cases were based on lies. I mean, neither of those women wanted abortions. Their attorneys tricked them into being the plaintiffs in the case. And actually, the woman who was Jane Roe, her attorney actually fast forward sat there next to New York's governor when he signed the partial birth abortion law.
Yeah.
So you see her agenda, but it's just so sad to see how these women were tricked. They didn't want to be in this. They used that to try to push through the killing of these precious unborn children.
You know, for many years, I said that I was convicted that I would live to see the day that Roe v. Wade is overturned. Liberty Counsel filed an amicus brief in the case, a friend of the court brief. We represented over 70,000 African American and Hispanic churches. In that particular brief, we overviewed the eugenic history, the racist history of abortion, going back to Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger, having the same ideology of Charles Darwin and Adolf Hitler, and that is Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species talks about the preservation of favored races. It talks about essentially survival of favored races, and that's what it was about. And he was someone who believed that certain races didn't deserve to live and that they would be overpowered by other races, and the best race would ultimately survive.
He called them weeds, those people.
He called them weeds, and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger wanted to eliminate particularly black communities, brown communities, other communities of lower intelligence or various kinds of medical or psychological conditions. And so consequently, that decision is over. But now, Holly, we rejoice in that. It's an amazing, most significant term in our lifetime.
But the work's not done.
But the work is not done.
We've just begun.
Because once you take back some of this ground, there's a lot of angry people that don't like the fact that you have an opportunity to speak as a Christian. You can speak freely. That you have an opportunity to have free exercise of religion. And that now there is no hiding behind some Supreme Court decision to kill innocent children. So now the battle, with regards to life particularly, is in Congress, because there's efforts in Congress to pass an abortion bill and impose it federally. There's also the battle on the states with regards to states. Battles in the courtroom, battles in the legislature. And obviously every time you go to the polls, you have to really think about who are you going to cast your vote for, because as a believer, as a non-believer, when you vote, you are appointed an agent to act on your behalf. And that agent acts for you. Just like if you have an agent to close on a property, the agent is acting for you, binding you. Voting is a prophetic act, and you are appointed an agent to act in your position, whether it's on the local, state, or national level. If that agent doesn't believe in religious freedom and the sanctity of human life, freedom of speech, then that is imputed to you. So we have to be, and you have to be, vigilant, because when you look at how all this came about, how all this came about was prayer, which is what we ought to do all the time, and never cease whenever you have temporary setbacks. And if you look at all the history from 1973 till 2022, there were a lot of major temporary setbacks on abortion cases all over the country. A lot of lives have been lost.
Right.
A lot of blood has been shed.
And you know, regarding the life issue, Matt, we at Liberty Counsel, we're still fighting Planned Parenthood as we defend Sandra Merritt and the horrendous charges they put and the dollars they put on her head for actually revealing that Planned Parenthood sells aborted baby body parts.
Yeah, but that they were having their babies aborted and third parties were actually providing these to research facilities for
Right, our civil and criminal
sale.
cases are still going on.
So pray for this country. Obviously, that's obvious in all that we do. Pray on the issue of life because it's an incredible victory that was won at the U.S. Supreme Court. But on the other hand, the battle is intensified in Congress, and that battle should not be intensified there. But why? It's because people put people in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, that shouldn't be there because they don't respect the sanctity of human life. So remember that when you go to the polls every single time. Remember that when we go to the polls and we elect people locally who may ultimately end up at the state level or eventually in Congress. Remember that we have an obligation to extend our biblical Christian values into the marketplace, whether it's in the ballot box or someplace else. There is no place that's off limits. And never get discouraged,
Right.
because the battle is clearly at the state level. And Liberty Counsel is involved not only at the federal level, but also working on the state level in the state legislatures, but also with the courts, because a lot of the litigation is happening in the courts as well.
But you know, God calls us to take action, to stand up. We don't sit and cower and just, you know, wring our hands because of the situation. We have to stand up. Of course, we pray, but we have to be involved in our local and our national processes, you know, and be involved as His voice.
And, you know, make sure that you are, and the pastor is, addressing these issues.
Oh, that's an important one.
These are life issues, you know. If you don't address them, I can guarantee you they're going to be addressed to your congregation, to your people, to
and
those
that's a
that
lot
sit
of our
beside you.
problem, Matt, is the church has been silent, so we have to speak up.
Absolutely, and so we have to speak up, and we also not only have to speak up, but make sure that you reach out to people in your community, because there's a lot of hurting people out there that need the church now more than ever. And not only pray, but put hands and feet to that.
Right.
There's crisis pregnancy centers that can be started. There's crisis pregnancy centers everywhere that can receive and be helped by your presence. And there's people in your church that need the church and the healing power of Jesus Christ. I just want to encourage you, because this was such an incredible term in 2022. It was decades in the making. Never, ever, ever, ever give up. This is a generational changing series of cases that will affect everybody for the rest of our lives. And there's more to come. With God, remember, all things are possible.
Matt, help those at home understand this really was a Supreme Court for the ages.
It really was, and it was generations in the making. If you go back to 1973, and even before that, 1971, you had the Lemon versus Kurtzman case. That was overturned. 1973, Roe versus Wade, nearly 50-year-old precedent. That was overturned. The consequences of these decisions are incredible. Generations in the making. They were the foundation of Liberty Counsel. Why Liberty Counsel came to be in 1989 to strengthen free speech, to strengthen the free exercise of religion under the First Amendment, to get rid of this horrible 1971 Lemon test, and obviously to overturn Roe v. Wade. That's the reason that I moved from the pastoral ministry into law. All of that came to pass between May the 2nd and June the 27th, 2022, one case after another, after another, after another. As a result of those cases, not only were they generations in the making and having generational impact that will permeate in so many areas of our life, but there's really a cultural divide out there, Steve. We have received increased levels of threats of people who are angry over the fact that the Supreme Court is actually interpreting things according to the Constitution, angry that the idea that you can't kill children is now no longer protected by the Supreme Court as it once was since 1973. And that sanctity of human life is something that is prevailing across the country. They're angry at this, and it's a dark anger. But you know what? God has incredibly orchestrated this moment in history. I knew I would live to see the time when the abortion decisions were overturned. I think for us as individuals, maybe obviously very few people have an opportunity to go before the U.S. Supreme Court, but everyone has issues or battles in their life. God has called us to be transformed and to transform the culture around us. And there's a lot of things in our community, in our world, in our nation that may be dark, that may be depressing, that may be overwhelming. But you know what? God just called us to be faithful day by day by day by day. And what is intended for harm, you said this before, and we said it many times on Freedom Alive, God can turn around for good. And the difference between that is one person like a Joseph standing up, like Hal Shurtleff standing up, like a Coach Kennedy saying no, standing up, like the cases that brought this abortion decision to the United States Supreme Court. It really means that it comes down to you standing up for whatever it is that God is calling you to do. But never get discouraged.
I can't agree more. One of the best things I love about reading the Bible, Moses, Joseph, Joshua, David, the improbable, miraculous victories that God orchestrates, right? Time after time after time in battle or in other instances. This feels like that to me. I mean, God is really fighting for His kids and His people.
You know, a lot of us, we want to pray for a miracle. We like to see miracles. And I say this when we go to Israel, but none of us want to be in a position where we actually need a miracle. But it's those miracle moments, it's those adversity moments that ultimately birth a new day. It's when you need that miracle, it's when you face that adversity and you continue to press into God, and God intervenes and brings about that miracle, uses that adversity for something positive, uses what was intended for harm to turn around and do something for good. And that's God's economy, by just pressing deeper into God, no matter what your situation is.
Well said, well said. It's our delight to bring you stories like this time after time on Freedom Alive. In closing, remember Galatians 5 verse 1, which says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. So join us here next time, where you will hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.